All right. So, as it turns out, this will be our last live Zoom session together. And I want to tell you all how much I appreciate your work, your effort, your discussion, your great ideas throughout this mini semester. It's really been terrific. Thank you for that. Also, before we wrap up today, we'll just move through how far you've come since the beginning of the semester. Before we do that, we've got a few tech talks. Let's see if everyone's here who is giving them. We've got Meredith and Faithon, Charlie and Rosie. So we've got everybody but Charlie at the minute. Okay, who would like to go first?
So today I'll be talking about Luis Barragan's architecture. So Luis Barragan was a Mexican architect and engineer, and his work has influenced contemporary architects visually and conceptually. He was born in Guadalajara, Mexico in 1902 and graduated as engineer and architect in 1925. After graduating from school, he went to Europe for a 2-year trip for studies and leisure and without attending any institution. And during his trip, he became struck with the beauty of the garden in Europe, such as the picture on the right, which is the general life in Granada. Since then, he retained his interest in the landscape architecture. And he was also influenced by European modernism after visiting Le Corbusier, a Swiss-born French architect whose work emphasized elemental geometric forms and structures. And in Barragan's work, he also employed Corbusier's concept of the fifth facade, which is the term used to describe the landscape potential of the urban roofscape. And as one of the greatest architects in Mexico, he revolutionized the modern architecture in the country with the use of bright colors, reminiscent of the traditional buildings in Mexico, and also brought the concept of emotional architecture, which is and also state that any work of architecture which does not express serenity is a mistake. And we will go further into details in the following slides. And speaking of his architectural style, one of the most obvious feature is the use of colors in his work. So Barragan's architecture created human's dialogue with the environment and Mexican culture. So for example, in the Casa Luis Barragan, also called Casa Gilardi, forget my pronunciation.
Oh, you're doing well.
Luis Barragan's home designed by himself. So it was built by rolled volcanic stones and created human's dialogue with the environment and even with the Mexican culture. And also influenced by Corbusier. And in Barragan's architecture, he combined geometric structures with vibrant colors of traditional Mexico in his work. So the satellite tower, which is one of his most famous work, the prism get their geometry tricks as the movement changes its perceptions. Oops, sorry. And the use of intense colors, such as the greens and yellows and blues, illustrate cosmopolitan Mexican devotion. As you might tell, Barragan is an expert in using simple but intense colors in creating a sense of abstraction. So in his concept, the color has a deep impact on emotion and perceptions, and he has employed them as primary building blocks to create a sensory experience. So in his house, the colors are not just thin surfaces that materialize the face of his volumes, but also are capable of having volumes and weight by themselves. So on the middle and right image, you can see that it is the main entrance and the vestibule of Casa Luis Barragan. The honey yellow of the entrance hall saturates the pupil to receive the pink of the vestibule. And the pink also works as preparation and catalyst. So if you open a new door, you can see the picture on the right, which is the dining hall. And the dining hall contains the intense shady green of the garden as backgrounds. So you can tell the colors along the way from the entrance hall to the dining room provide a feeling of movement to the building and also determine the circulation. And Barragan also create a sense of abstraction and divide between different spaces. from the use of colors. So the interior of this building use primary colors such as what we saw, like the pink and yellows and blues. However, the walls of the courtyard are complex secondary colors, such as vivid lavenders, deep rose, and olive greens, so that it separates the interior and kind of exterior space, and also public and private spaces. And what another feature of Louis Barragan's architectural style is the use of light. And most of the house he built is designed not to need artificial light during daytime, with windows placed to let in as much light as possible, such as on the image shown on the right, shown on the left. So this huge floor-to-ceiling windows work kind of connect the inner dining room to the garden outside and let in abundant natural light. Another great evidence of how the light work is the swimming pool. So the water in the swimming pool vibrates with the geometries produced by the changing daylight that is transforming this area throughout the day. So you can tell that the light and the water and the building itself create a sense of movement inside the building. And Barragan is also an expert in using hidden light source to create the interior and to give interior subtle and lyrical atmosphere. So for example, in the chapel for the Cappuccina's sacrament areas, light enter from two sources which filter and transform it. The natural light enters the rear of the building through a concrete lattice wall painted yellow, as shown in the left image, and more light comes in through a golden glass window. So this light source is hidden from our view, but it illuminates the large wooden cross from the side and projecting a cruciform shape on the altar. And this shows how Barragan used daylight and shadows in his design to create a sense of serenity, as we mentioned at the beginning. And another feature of his architectural style is the use of circulation and space. So on the right floor plan, you can see the general layout of the Casa Louis Barragan. So you might be able to tell there's no access to the first floor courtyard from any of the front areas, not even a window. And the only access is from the dining room in the rear. And this forces people to travel through a golden yellow light-filled corridor in order to enter the first floor courtyard area. So it's kind of like the flow in this building is restricted by the architect intentionally. Another feature in this house is that stairways. So the stairway is made up of pine boards and leads to a door that is always closed. And also the stair is very sturdy, and its visual delicacy is such that to ascend it seems possible only if gradual weightlessness was achieved. And it was inspired by the dreamlike quality of Jean Verdeman de Vries' drawing of solitary architectural space in his book Perspective. So there's a picture. So the picture on the left shows the drawing, and the left shows the Louis Barragan's design. So you can tell there's kind of similarity in between. And nowadays, most of the work by Louis Barragan were turned into museums. And when I did my research, I found a pretty interesting video called "The Dancing Through the Architecture of Louis Barragan." So in 2018, Casa Louis Barragan hosts a body bending dance troupe who twist and move through the geometric building's colorful space and rooms. I really like this video because it shows how the light, colors, and dancers' body cooperate with each other in this site. And it kind of also illustrates how the human body's dialogue with the nature, and kind of reminds me of what we learned before in class about how the blocks and concrete relates to human body. So that is pretty interesting. So if you're interested in Louis Barragan's architecture, I strongly recommend this video. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic, Beifan. Questions, comments? How does this relate to any of the architectural forms we've looked at before?
I just wanted to make a comment about the staircases.
Yeah,
Those were really interesting and also incredibly scary. I would not feel
absolutely.
comfortable walking on that one that was on the right that had like nothing underneath it. Like that's so scary. But like so interesting that they like found a way to make that work and make it stable enough.
Did you have that same feeling, Faifan, when you first began looking at it?
Yes, I was so surprised that there's no like any supporting tools beside the stairway, and I feel like it's beautiful but also scary.
As I was looking at it, I still feel like no, there's got to be steel behind it. There has to be a steel bar holding it up. It's just, it is mind blowing that it's going to be okay to walk up that staircase. Yeah, great. What else? What about the use of light? How does that relate to any of the forms we've looked at?
I mean, I just in general, I think it's really cool that he was able to purposefully manipulate the shadows to kind of generate whatever shape he wanted.
Yeah.
Like the cross specifically was really cool. I think they do that in some other churches, like even around here. They'll like purposely try to have their cross cast some sort of shadow.
Right, right. And it's such an incredible way of thinking about, we think about architecture, except in the Gothic period. We think about architecture as being solid, as we're dealing with the mass of things in some way. But as in the Gothic cathedrals and in Barragan's work and the way he brings that back in, as well as what we saw from Nehemiah in the last class too, this embrace of the control and manipulation of light to create atmosphere, to create a different dimension to the architecture is really stunning. And Barragan is such a master at that. What about the use of color? Yeah, Sophie, then Ellen.
I thought the use of color was really cool, especially like the contrast between going all the way through that vestibule and kind of like changing the colors, but still kind of being able to see what was on the other side. And so having those really bright colors really brought something special to the architecture. And I think that's something that you don't always see. Like the interior design doesn't always reflect the exterior of the building itself. So kind of including those two elements together was really cool.
Excellent. Ellen?
I agree with that. And I made a connection to like my area because in Florida, if you're beachside, seeing colorful houses, that's very common. So like just seeing like the colors that he chose to use and how the inside was like lighter colors just reminded me of the beach.
I really like your connection to locality with the color, because this is something that really stands out about Barragan's work, where we saw Nehemiah's work, and if you looked in more detail at some of the famous modernist architects, the vast majority are working with white plastered concrete, white cubes, white squares, white, white, white everywhere. And that begins to take on, it's called the international style. We're not going into it in any more detail than that, but it was called the international style because the people who conceived this idea thought it doesn't have any local identity, and thus it can be international. Glass and steel, these aren't things, that relate directly to the materials in my state or nation. And so they can be materials for everybody. But just as we've seen in recent dialogues, once we start to assume that not paying attention to particularity is a panacea, you begin to realize that particular locations, people who have pride in who and where they're from, are really left out of that dialogue. And what Barragan was trying to highlight is the rich and colorful history of particularly Mexican art and architecture. And so he really gave place to those very modernist forms through that use of layered color. So it's, on the one hand, it's just like fun and pretty to look at, but he's also really trying to give some location to the work that he's creating. Great. Any other questions or comments on that? Okay. Thanks for your presentation, Faifan. It was terrific. Great. Rosie, did we get you back with sound this time? No, it's still not working. Do you happen to have, I know you've probably already checked all of these things, but you don't happen to have earphones that are plugged in that are taking your sound, or some, Do you want to write me in the chat? Okay. See if that might help.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Great.
Okay.
Okay.
I'm
Terrific.
so sorry about that.
No, it's fine. It's fine. Sometimes that happens when you're hearing us, but you're
Okay, perfect. Sorry about that.
no problem. Okay, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Okay.
All right.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
It's coming up. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so today I'm going to be presenting on Zaha Hadid's architectural work, and you may have read a bit about her in the homework for today, but you still may be wondering who exactly she is. So I personally have not heard of her until I researched for this presentation, but ever since I fell in love with her work, her geometry, her shapes are so cool and so unique and so inspiring. I've honestly never seen anything like it before. So I hope all of you fall in love with it too, just like I did. Okay, so first, who is she? So a little bit about her background. She was born in Baghdad, Iraq in 1950 in a time when the city started investing in architecture. So that could have had a big influence on her future career and kind of her decision to go into architecture. And she also grew up in a multicultural background and attended an international school. In addition, she had a very strong love for abstract art and abstract painting. So all of this could have kind of played into her future career of forming these really abstract buildings. And overall, she was an Iraqi-British architect and one of the top female architects in the world. She even was, I'm sorry about the noise in the background, by the way. She was even one of the first woman to ever receive the Pritzker Architecture Prize, which is pretty impressive and so amazing. It shows how inspiring she really is. And besides being an architect, she's also an interior designer, into fashion, and also an industrial designer. But unfortunately, in 2016, she actually died of a heart attack in Miami, which is pretty sad. Okay, so a bit about her materials and her styles. So in terms of materials, most of her buildings are composed of concrete and then also glass and steel. And she's so incredibly talented that she's able to manipulate the once seemingly rigid structure of concrete into this soft and weightless structure, as you can see in the left. I just think that's so cool with the curves and everything. It's so incredible how she does this. And she also tends to use composite materials, so she pretty much combines two or more materials together in order to produce a stronger one to help keep the structure in place. And in terms of style, she doesn't identify with a specific style because she doesn't want to limit herself to just only one. But other people have described her work as deconstructivist, modernist, abstractionist, and parametricist. But she is widely regarded as the queen of the curve, as you can see from the left photo. And many people consider her radical in style. And although she doesn't have a specific style, she does represent reappearing features all throughout her work, and you often will see curving facades, sharp angles, curvy linear geometry, and a futuristic modern look to her work. And there's also what I found was really interesting is a lot of her work has a connection to nature, whether it be landscapes or water or waves. So I noticed that keeps appearing in her work, which is pretty cool. Okay, so the first building I'm going to go over, excuse my pronunciation, but the Heydar Aliyev Center. So first we're going to discuss this, and it's pretty incredible. If you look at it, it's so cool. I can't even begin to describe it. So it's made out of, so first the purpose actually, the building is a cultural center. So it includes an auditorium, a gallery hall, and a museum all in one. It was named after the president of the country, and it has 8 floors, including underground parking. And it's made out of reinforced concrete, which we learned about in class. And it's also made of steel molds and fiberglass reinforced with polyester and concrete. So it's pretty mesmerizing, this building. You can truly see the beauty with the folds and curves and the flowy structure. And it has so much continuity, and it's so fluid. And the building even looks almost like an ocean wave, I noticed. It just reminds me of that. And I think this was a purposeful choice. And it really, this wave-like structure extends from the ground above to the sky. And with that, along with the white color, it really shows it's pointing to a bright future of the city due to what this cultural center offers to the public. And then the exterior of the building is also made out of glass, like very bright glass, allowing natural light in. And there's no sharp edges on the outside. And I can definitely notice the curves on the right side of the image. So if you look at the right picture on the right side, the curves, that was probably one of my favorite parts, because this like ramp-like form really seems to almost be inviting you into the structure. It seems almost like a ramp telling you to come in, a road coming in, and that's perfect for this cultural center, inviting the community in. And it's really a symbol of the community and invitingness and the importance of community for this culture. Okay, so next we'll look at Galaxy Soho in Beijing. This one is also so incredible. If you just look at it, nothing like it. So the purpose of this building, it's composed of retail stores, offices, and entertainment, and it was built from 2009 to 2012. And just take a moment to observe the structure, like look at its panoramic structure and its incredible curves. It's so cool. And as you can see, well, you can only see 3 in the photo on the right, but there are 4 flowing continuous bodies or volumes, and each of them are connected by the little bridges in between. And the bridges connect them from one to another, and it's a curvy linear structure, and it looks really organic in sense. Almost reminded me of like a chicken egg or something like that, but Hadid saw it more looking as a grain of rice. So specifically, she used China's terraced rice fields as a model to design this building, and it really emphasizes her focus on nature and showing a strong link between her architectural work and nature itself. And in other terms of environmental impacts, this building was designed to be very environmentally friendly. It's LEED certified, has parking for low energy vehicles and low fuel vehicles, and has bike storage areas. And there are even cooled roofs, high efficient lighting and water systems. And these systems reduce the overall water consumption by 20% in the building, which is really great and necessary. And on the left picture, you can see a bit of the interior. And as you can see, there's a lot of open space with all the shops lined up along it. And she chose this style to represent traditional Chinese architecture, similar to the courtyard feel back in the day. However, it was criticized, though, because some people said it destroyed the preservation of the streets and the traditional courthouse housing. Okay, perfect. Next, we're going to look at the Glasgow Riverside Museum of Transport, which is in Scotland. And this was built from 2007 to 2011. And it's located at the A&J English Shipyard, and visitors are even allowed to arrive by boat, which I think is really cool, just like showing up on boat to see a museum. So its structural framework is made of stacks of steel, reinforced concrete, and there's also trenches, and on the roof are steel beams, and it's lined with zinc on top of the roofs and the facade. And another material on the building, as you can all see, probably the most obvious one is the glass. And this allows a natural light source into the building onto the exhibit, making it easier to see the exhibit and everything. And the sharp pointy edges on top are so cool. I really like that part. Just like I'm in awe just looking at the building. All these are so cool. Anyway, so this one, similar to the nature-like structures of the other one, when I saw this building, I immediately thought of a wave. It looks like the wave structure just looks for other buildings, which I think is pretty significant. It could represent a link between the river that's located next to this building and the nearby city of Glasgow. And it could also represent, because this is a column-free passageway and it's an open space between the river and the city, it's showing kind of like a link between nature and the city and nature and humanity, in addition to it symbolizes the relationship between the city of Glasgow and their history with shipbuilding and their history on the sea. Purpose was for the London 2012 Olympics, specifically for swimming, diving, and asynchronized swimming. So the building can fit around 2,800 people, but there are also additional seats for 1,000 more for big events. And now that the 2012 Olympics have passed, the building is a community center, just like the other one we looked at, where people can go to get swim lessons, diving lessons, and fitness lessons. And it's made of concrete mixes and glass, and there's specifically 628 panes of glass, which allow in the natural light, just like her other buildings. And it includes double curvature geometry. And just like Galaxy Soho, the one we looked at in Beijing, this building is very environmentally friendly. The aquatic center is insulated. It has high efficiency heat recovery and water heating systems. And something that I thought was really cool was that the main pool is completely lit by the natural light from the outdoors, which is pretty amazing. They save so much on electricity, and it's very great for the environment, which is really important. And also, they even have rainwater harvesting for irrigation purposes. So it's very environmentally friendly, which I really admire in all of her work. And similar to the wave-like structure in her other buildings, this one embodies that as well. The fluid geometry can represent like a pure and powerful movement of water. It looks just like a wave is coming in to crash at you. And it could be representative of the swimming, the purpose of the building, in addition to the body of water, as you can see in the bottom right photo in front of it, representative of the natural landscape around the building. And then if you look at the top of the plan, it actually looked quite similar to me of the slave ships that we looked at from coming to the US, such as the Brooks, which is quite interesting how similar that they do actually look. But then overall, minus that point, this building can represent the community as it's bright, full of natural light, and the wave structure almost just like a hand wave. It's like waving you into the building, letting you come in and everything. And it shows her Hadid's connection to nature and the environment, which it reappears in all of her work. Okay, so now, although her buildings are very beautiful, there is a lot of controversy involved with it, and there are many critics with her work. So many people criticize the scale and expenses involved in her projects. Some people, for example, for the London Aquatic Center, they forced her to scale down her design. And then for the 2020 Olympics Stadium in Tokyo, that was supposed to be this summer, but is not anymore due to coronavirus, had a lot of controversy as well. Japanese architects criticized how expensive it was and how insensitive it was, and they forced her to scale down the project and then eventually completely stop the project overall, which for someone of her stature, that's very unusual because they normally would not do that for people. But overall, the most controversial of her buildings was definitely excuse my pronunciation, the Al-Waqar Stadium in Qatar. And pretty much there was a 2014 report that said 1,000 workers in this building, constructing this building, died from poor conditions and were forced into slave-like conditions and human rights abuses. So Hadid denied that this happened in the building that she designed. And eventually the critic who said it was a false claim. So there was a whole thing about who to believe about the situation. Eventually Hadid ended up suing the critic in a defamation lawsuit, and they eventually settled. She received an apology and donated the money she received to a charity for labor right protection. So this is definitely, as you can see here in the photo, this is the stadium and what it looks like. And then a few other controversial buildings that she had include the one that she built for the Iraqi parliament, which was criticized for being too much for a country still recovering from war. And then also some of her buildings in China were criticized for not addressing the social and environmental problems. Okay, and now for her legacy. So other notable buildings that we did not have time to discuss include, sorry about the pronunciation again, the Guangzhou Opera House in China, the Sheikh Zayed Bridge in the United Arab Emirates, and then also the Eli and Edith Broad Art Museum at Michigan State University. So she even made her way into the United States and many countries throughout the world, and continents as well. So she clearly is legendary, as you can see from her architecture. Her ability to shape concrete into this soft, fluid form is truly incredible. And she shaped geometry's new identity and had such an important emphasis on nature and the environment, seeing her environmentally friendly buildings and her wave-like structures that continue to repeat in her work. And she was so focused on her work that she actually never got married. And despite her criticism, she had an immense amount of success as an Iraqi woman in a very white male-dominated field. And I credit her for her confidence and strength throughout it all, because it must be really tough. And then she was also able to design 950 projects in 44 different countries, that's so many. That's truly incredible. Many of you, maybe if you've ever traveled, have seen some of these buildings. And she was not only an amazing architect, but she also fought for her rights. She once said that architecture is no longer a man's world. This idea that a woman can't think three-dimensionally is ridiculous. And then she also said, another quote was, "Your success will not be determined by your gender or your ethnicity, but only on your scope of your dreams and your hard work to achieve them." So that's it. And thank you guys. I hope you learned a lot.
Great. Fantastic, Rosie. Your love for the buildings really is conveyed well and draws us in. It's great. Really great.
Thank you.
Comments? Questions? Yes, Faithon. And then
Sorry, I feel like it's pretty interesting to see something I'm familiar with, because I have been to the Galaxy Soho for several times before, but I never realized that it's kind of ecologically friendly, and also like it is it's shape, how the shape is resemble with the rice. So I feel like it's kind of amazing.
it's fascinating that you've been there. How was the experience of going through the building? Is it pleasant, unpleasant?
Yeah, it was really good. Like, and this space basically just include everything you need, like the shopping mall, its restaurants, and just like everything you need. So it's pretty convenient for me.
Nice. Yeah. Fantastic. Matthew, you had a comment.
Yeah, I was just going to say it's like pretty amazing how extensive her work is, and just kind of like, you know, a good architect might be famous for one building and she's famous for so many. And like also if you think about like the challenges that she probably had to go through as like an Iraqi woman to be such a successful architect, I think it's pretty amazing. So I really liked Rosie's presentation, just like learning about this. I never heard of her until the reading yesterday, and very, very, as Rosie said, very, very cool architecture. So
Terrific. Yes, Christina, and then Meredith.
I was going to make a similar point to Matthew. I totally agree. She's very cool. I'd only been to her one building in like near Hudson Yards in New York City, which is like some condos near the High Line. But I had no idea she had all these buildings also all over the world. So that was awesome to see the different case studies that you pointed out.
Great work. Meredith.
I really liked how every building was very unique to like the country that it was in, and like they were all over the world, but also they like had still like a similar feel. Like you could tell that it was like her design. Like I really liked that they call her the Queen of Curve. Is that what you said? I think I thought that was cool. But once again, like everything was like unique to the country that it was in. But like if you look at the like techniques or like smaller detail, you could tell that it was like somewhat related, which I thought was cool.
So what architecture from the past is she drawing on for her work? See, maybe Brad or Lucas or Sophie. Hard to tell. Yeah, Sophie.
I was thinking maybe like some of the concrete shells that we saw in Brasilia, because as Rosie said, she used a lot of concrete to create those really cool shapes that we see, and we kind of saw something similar in Gabby's presentation the other day.
Yeah, absolutely. She's part of that shell tradition. But in that video that I posted for you for today, what is she doing differently with shells? All right, if you haven't had a chance to see it, please watch it. Okay, Meredith. Good.
Was it how they were kind of making, I could be thinking about the wrong video, but the video where they made like the cloth stuff?
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it was like they made it on top of it so that they used less of like, instead of creating this huge mold that they usually made, it was like they put this like cloth together when they got there.
Yep, exactly. So by making a fabric form, they reduce the amount of, I mean, there's still some timber involved, but they've dramatically reduced the amount of timber, and they're able to get those beautiful curves and parabolas and just beautiful shapes. Technologically, we've talked about how different advances in tech make different architecture possible. Can you see the tie-in between Hadid's work and the technology she's using? And if so, what is that? Yeah, Lucas.
I mean, I think Rosie said in every single one of her buildings, this one's energy efficient, this one's energy efficient, this one's ecologically efficient. So like she went out of her way to make sure that like she was using water efficiency, she was using natural light, just like probably natural cooling or low AC, and didn't really hesitate to use kind of an indoor-outdoor feel with the glass.
Yeah, excellent. So she's really doing everything she can to push those buildings to maximum efficiency. Now, to do that, she is meeting very strict LEED standards. LEED is the sort of governing body for ecological efficiency in buildings. We could push back on that in her buildings as we could in any contemporary architect's buildings, not singling her out, in that we know the demand that concrete has on the environment. And we know the demand that heating and cooling have on the environment. And while she was incredibly smart about it, and her buildings are, for the materials used, they are very, very efficient, admirably so. The thing with architecture is we still have this love for high energy materials, and that is changing. There's some fascinating bamboo projects that we saw earlier in the course, for example, that are trying to push that, but it's still tricky to think about something that is solid and sound that isn't an ecological drain. What's the other tech implied in her buildings? Yeah, Matthew.
We looked at it and for the knit structure as well, but it seems like it's highly digitally modeled before it's being built, because like the geometry doesn't look like it would work when you're just looking at the building, but it's clearly like mathematically supported.
Yep.
And then they go ahead and proceed with the building.
Yeah, absolutely. So computer modeling, beginning even in the 90s, really took architecture into a realm of new possibility. And Hadid is one who embraced that early on and made it, really optimized what she could in terms of the shapes that could be engineered and then understood. Most of that, of course, required advanced modeling to make sure that those curves were going to hold up and that the structures would be structurally sound. And she is at the forefront of that movement. That has advanced into a place that's now called blob architecture, where people are making like crazy blob shapes, and they can do that because it's being done on computers. But sometimes just because you can doesn't mean you should. But Hadid strikes this great balance between making something very usable and still pushing the tech forward. So yeah, great. Thank you for that. Okay. Any other questions or comments on that front? Just one more thing. The Pritzker Prize is basically the Nobel Prize for architecture. There isn't a Nobel Prize for architecture. So the people on the Pritzker list have been determined by a jury to be really pushing the envelope in terms of architecture design. So thanks for mentioning that. All right, who's next? We have Meredith. Great.
Yeah, that works.
Anybody else have this? Okay.
I
need to pass it back to you. Actually, yep, that's me.
Okay. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm talking about Frank Lloyd Wright's Falling Water. I actually decided to choose this because I'm from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, so it's like less than 2 hours from my house. A lot of people go there, like they actually make like a day trip, very easy. And my sister and her fiance actually went last summer, so she was able to send me some pictures that she took. So a lot of the pictures in here are from my sister. So just some background. Falling Water was created by Frank Lloyd Wright in 1935, located in Mill Run, Pennsylvania. The house was built to serve as a vacation home for the Kaufman family, and the Kaufman family is known for Kaufman's department store. I don't know if this is a Pittsburgh thing. My mom would always talk about going there when she was a kid. And basically, before the house was even there, the Kaufman family thought of this waterfall as their like personal getaway for many years, and they decided that they wanted to build a home to be able to see the waterfall at all times. So once they decided that they wanted Wright to create the house for them, he actually took this wish one step further and integrated the house into the waterfall. So the house was built directly on top of it. The house continued to serve as a vacation home to the Kaufman family until I think 1963, when Edgar Kaufman donated and entrusted the house to the Western Pennsylvania Conservancy. So now it basically serves as a museum, like people to go and visit and look at all the amazing architecture. So who was Frank Lloyd Wright? He is often described as one of the most prolific, unorthodox, and controversial masters of 20th century architecture. So as you can see from those past two photos, his work is very cutting edge. It's something we see as modern and organic, which I'll get into in a second. So a lot of people really critiqued his work at the time, but he still kept going with it. He had a very unique view on how to use space and structure as a tool to convey someone's personal values. He often built with the intention of displaying his views of America. He saw America as a country with people with deep connections to both each other and their land. So he also had a really deep love for Japanese architecture, which whenever I show you the inside of the building, I think you'll be able to see a lot of things that seem very like something that you would see in a Japanese building. And his main goal, he really, really loved organic architecture because it was part of his way to balance his surroundings with the architecture and like make it flow very nicely with his work. And I'll get onto this later, but his architecture foreshadowed many of today's sustainability concerns. So yeah, he also had a school of architecture in Arizona, and here he often told his students that the landscape where they build on should be more beautiful when they leave, which I think really conveys his goals. So here's the plan of this is the second floor plan. Every room in the house was made to emphasize the beauty of the natural surroundings. Here you can see that like we have the master bedroom, guest room. Each room has a way to get onto the terrace. And overall, there was two parts. There was a main house, which had 3 bedrooms, open living room, compact kitchen, and there was also a guest house, which I don't think you can see on here, but yeah. So here is a section view of Falling Water. I like this view because it shows you just how much, I have a hard time pronouncing this, the cantilevered terraces come out. And it also shows you all the like stone that it's made of and just how like everything's kind of leveled, like kind of looks like steps when you go up them. So he built the entire house around the fireplace, which you can see in the section here, and here it is in here, which I think is interesting because fire is like yet another natural element. So he wanted to focus it there. He thought it was important because he thought that's where the entire family gathers and gets together. So obviously I couldn't really find any good pictures that showed this, but you can kind of try to imagine it. Obviously this is really open here, but the hallways of this house were very narrow and dark, and he did this with the intention to intensify the experience whenever you got outside. So basically you just wanted, once you got into an open room or even onto the terrace, it was more of like an opening feel or an expansion. And also you can kind of tell from this photo, but some of those ceilings in the house were only like 6 feet and 4 inches tall. He did this so that your eye would go forward instead of up, so that you're always looking towards the windows in front of you or looking towards the outside. As I mentioned before, the house is decorated with several cantilevered terraces. So cantilevered means it like extends out from the actual like base of the home. And all of these, I'll go back a little bit, but all of these shoot out at right angles, and they kind of added a sense of sculpture to the house while also providing yet another cue to the natural beauty that surrounds it. So here I thought was where you could see a lot of the Japanese architecture and like design inside. Can you guys see my mouse? I hope so. So here I thought it was interesting to see like the floor cushions, like, which is often there's how Japanese at dinner tables. And I don't know what to call this, but I guess like the siding here is also very Japanese design.
It would generally be called trim, like if you were going to a house and there'd be trim, he's just taken trim in a very different direction. So.
Yeah. And then I also thought the ceiling right here was another cue towards his love for Japanese architecture. So here's another thing that was really cool about the house. The corner turning windows. This creates the illusion of vanishing corners. This is part of what I think makes the house so modern. Basically, like the house, when you look at it, is very obvious, like very geometric, like rectangles and squares, but still it kind of gives it a more soft, because of these corner turning windows, it gives it more of a soft, less like rigid feel to it. And then I thought this was really cool. As I keep mentioning, it was like his goal was to really like seamlessly fit this building into the surroundings, and they obviously were trying to like avoid taking and cutting down as much of the trees as possible to build this. So there are even like bending trellis beams like that bend around trees so that they didn't have to cut them down and they could keep them where they grew naturally. Here's there's stairs that come straight from the living room down directly into the waterfall, which very cool. So today they are really working on a preservation campaign for falling water for many reasons. I'll start to give some background. So whenever they first began the drawing out the blueprint for this building, there were several doubts about how stable the ground was to build on. And Edgar Kaufman had actually already been really interested in architecture before this and had studied some engineering. So he was kind of nervous about it. So he sent the blueprint to another engineer, and the guy said, basically, do not proceed with this. The ground is not stable. This is not a good idea. And Wright took this like very personally and did not enjoy this. So he continued with it anyway, but he did agree to add some more steel reinforcements as well as to increase their diameters. So the engineer who told them this wasn't a good idea, concerns proved to be accurate. So now there are several issues with the cantilevered terraces. They keep getting cracks in them because there's not enough support, and people keep repeating, like keep filling them and repairing them, but like the cracks keep getting bigger. Also, the cantilever terraces are beginning to sag, so the parts that poke out a little bit more are sagging down, and some of them as much as 7 inches, so I'm sure that's very concerning.
And so now there's a campaign to raise money to incorporate, they're called tension cables. So basically I don't really know exactly how they're doing it, but they're going to implement tension cables to provide more support. And the goal of this was so they didn't have to take away from his main architecture. They were like without having to add like more beams or anything else. I think they are trying to raise $3 million. I'm sure that's already been done. So that's where that is. And then this is my sister and her fiance. So you can pretend that kind of looks like me. People say we look alike. So my thoughts, I think this building is really interesting and really cool, very peaceful looking. And I think it's kind of interesting that it was built in the 30s, because I think this is how more buildings today should be built. It really took incorporating the environment into it, and trying as much as possible to not take down what's around it, and actually enhance what is around it. So I think today a lot of people are trying to find ways to be sustainable and while also still getting what they want from a building. And I don't really know what the energy sustainability is in this building. I'm sure it's not amazing, but I think in the way that it was built, and even the beams that go around the trees, and just emphasizing the beauty of nature is really cool. Obviously it's kind of in the woods, maybe in the middle of nowhere. That's kind of, some people, that's not really what everyone wants. But I think when we learned about the skyscrapers built in wood, stuff like that, just really working to work with the environment. So then I did some food for thought questions for you guys to think about. So how do you feel about the idea of living a part of the nature that surrounds you while still being in such a beautiful home? And do you think we lose anything from living like this? And what do you think we gain?
Great questions.
And that's it. So you guys can think about those questions. Yeah.
Comments, feedback, responses?
I feel like there's a lot to gain by living like this, because you really become connected to nature and you appreciate the natural environment around us, which has been taken away so much by the building of cities and skyscrapers, and it just takes away from the natural beauty that the earth has given us.
Brad.
I also think there's a lot to lose, because as you said, building this close to nature isn't necessarily the safest thing to do. Also, I think that if everybody tried to live in nature, then it wouldn't really be nature anymore, to be honest with you. So I think you have to do it very carefully. This one definitely pushes the boundary a little bit, I think.
Lucas.
Yeah, I personally wouldn't want to be living out by this. I like being able to call 911 and have an ambulance at my house within 20 minutes. So that, or a fire department too, at least within a community. It's really cool that he went out on a limb to do that, but I don't know, I value being near people.
Yeah, Matthew, and then Sophie.
Yeah, I was gonna say similar thing. I think I would consider doing this. I like living in cities, but I also kind of feel the attraction to kind of live in a more rural area. I think you have to balance how much you value proximity or community. If you're living in nature, if you're living fully in nature, you're probably not living near anyone else. And so that kind of comes down to your own personal preference. But I definitely can see the appeal, especially as an escape, even if it's not a primary residence, but just I've lived in cities all my life, and I kind of would like to go and take a break. I think it'll be interesting to see what happens with COVID, because there's kind of a discussion whether there'll be a flight from cities after this, after decades of transitioning to compressed cities. So that'll be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, absolutely. We're about to see a major redistribution. To Brad's point, if everyone moves to the country, it won't be the country anymore. But it potentially really a game changer in terms of development. Any other comments, questions? Yeah, Sophie.
I think for me, one of the coolest parts about this home is not only that it's located within nature itself, but the design of the building is really incorporating the nature into the home. So with all those windows where like you can't really see the corners. I think that's a really important aspect to living in nature, because it's not just the location, but it's the fact that you're including those natural elements within your home, and it's kind of almost like you're not really in a home. And I think that would be something that's really important to consider if you are going to choose to live in a more natural environment.
Great point. Have you encountered Frank Lloyd Wright's work before? Yes, no? So he is quite a character, and I will post a link to another 99% Invisible podcast about him, but it can be said almost across the board that every architect feels like they are the best architect who has ever existed. But Frank Lloyd Wright, there's no question, and there would be no question if you were near him, that he was the best. So I can see from what you're saying, Meredith, when someone said, no, this isn't sound, he is going to lose his mind and really push back on whoever that person was. But he did really bring a lot of new concepts to American architecture, and is generally considered the forerunner in American modernism, because he did it so differently. It wasn't the white cubes in the city, it was these modernist shapes integrated into the countryside. He's also part of why we have suburbs. He developed the first idea of a cooperative suburb with a lot of land around, very different than the way we think about many of them now, but he had very innovative ideas on expanding city life to include more nature, which is how that came about. Just if you're interested, he's an interesting one to track. Okay, fantastic. Thank you so much for your presentations today. This is terrific. Let's go, Meredith, if you'll pass it back to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I did it.
Okay. Yep, you did. Great. Terrific. Okay. So
my screen or no? Wait, can you still see my screen or no? I can't.
I can't. Can others?
Okay. No,
okay.
You're good.
Great. Okay. Can you see my screen with a PowerPoint presentation on it? Yes. Okay, good. Looks like we're going to have subtitles today. Maybe. In the time remaining, I want to take us through a quick jaunt from where we began to where we're finishing with the course. So we started out early on asking, what is architecture? If you think back for a minute to what you understood about architecture when you came into the class, what were some of the key things that you knew then? It's hard to do this retroactively because you've gained so much now, but in the answer to what is architecture, do you remember what your first points were generally? Yes, Sophie, and then Rosie.
For me, I think I kind of just thought about it as a place of shelter, and like sometimes could be more of an artistic element, but most of the time it was just more for basic purposes that served as like a workplace or home.
Right. Great. Rosie?
I was going to say the same thing. I used to just think of it as a shelter, and I used to only think of architecture as buildings. I never really thought of it as embodying anything else besides that. I would just pretty much, and I never used to really like look at the elements. I would just like walk around and not really think about it. But now, like, as I walk around, I can really see the distinct parts and understand it a lot more, which is really cool. But yeah, before it was just pretty much a habitat, a shelter for a person that they live in. But I used to not really think much more besides that.
In many of your early responses, you know, there's often a tendency to think about, like, we think about the technology of architecture, we think about the shelter function of architecture, and sometimes we think about it as art, but without really fleshing out what that kind of art is. So as we went through the class, we looked at it through the lens of Mies van der Rohe's statement that architecture is the will of an epoch or a time period translated into space. And we've seen that through a variety of different architectural styles. We talked about subconsciously or implicitly in each of the lectures, the way that a certain sort of artistry and interpretation of the culture comes into the work of architecture. We talked about it through the lens of reaching out to the people for whom it's built, integrating their cultural traditions. And then we talked about the tech. We looked at all the different ways that architecture happens. What are the techniques? What are the engineering tools, physics? What's involved in creating architecture in a material dimension? So along the way, we've been thinking about what architecture history is, what it can do. What are your answers to that question now? What is architectural history? Yeah, Ellen.
I think it's like an expression of a culture and their history and them making it in a way so that it can be preserved and experienced by others in the future.
Yeah, excellent, excellent. Lucas.
It's not really a direct answer to the question, but whenever I see architectural history, I just gravitate towards like preservation, because we've lost so much of it that like we're not able to even really address the architectural history if the architecture still isn't there.
Yeah, great point. When we've seen that in so many cases, things that have been lost, or understanding that's lost, or histories that are lost, or things that we're not even looking at because it's lost. Or we just don't have time in the class. There's also that possibility. But yes. Matthew, did you have your hand up, or was no? Okay, great. We'll keep going. And throughout the process, we've been thinking about why architecture matters. And in each of your presentations, you have come to really great conclusions about why that's the case. From today, thinking about how do we build more sustainably? How do we build in response to the places we're in, whether that's through design elements that reference a culture, through color, through technique. We've also learned how to read plans, sections, and elevations. And that's a tool you bring forward with you no matter what you do in your life and career. If you decide to build a house in your future, or you simply just need to orient yourself in space. So now just a quick overview. We went through the awkward teen years of the ancient pyramids as they moved from a mastodon into the glorious pyramids of Giza as we think about them now. We looked at the marvels of chthonic architecture, both in Petra, Persepolis, and elsewhere, thinking about how architecture can be tectonic in the case of things like the pyramids, and chthonic in other regions of the world where cliffs and valleys are more predominant. We looked at mud and earth as architectural materials to create buildings beyond what at least I thought was possible before learning about them, and how they reflect the culture, how they reflect the materiality in a place that looks like there aren't many building materials. There certainly always are. We thought about carpentry and building traditions, specifically through the lens of a series of temples and shrines in Japan and their reference to the city of Chang'an in China. Looked at pattern and abstraction and the Byzantine plan and the layering of culture and the layering of expression, from religious expression to just a human desire to create a space that says more than we're able to technically communicate with words. Throughout all the process, he looked at the building of architecture, post and lintels, arc and spandrel, arcades, domes, axial plans, Gaussian vaults, concrete shells. We stopped to think through the construction of race and its relationship to architecture and the call for equity, from everything from the current protests to the architecture of sugar. And we fast forwarded through the evolution of the cathedral plan, from the Romanesque to the Byzantine to the Gothic. What I'm starting into now are the points that will be on your exam. So we'll look at this later part. You won't have to do the Romanesque because you've already done that, but the Gothic happened in this latter part of the session. We looked at brick and its relationship to the human scale, as well as the techniques learned and borrowed from concrete shells into advanced applications like D'Este's Gaussian vaults that we see here. And we looked at the long evolution of concrete from its appearance in the Pantheon to the work of Perret and Maillart in really advancing what concrete could do in the early 20th century. And then today, to wrap up, we are going to look briefly at textiles, tensiles, and the Atoms for Peace project. Take a minute with the image on the left. What do you see when you look at it? What does it remind you of, if anything? Meredith. And then
Kind of looks like if you took a vase and just cut it in half and laid it on its side.
Yeah. Absolutely. Good. Ellen?
I was going to say the same thing. I think it just looks like a vase that was knocked over.
Yeah. Great. And Lucas?
I mean, I see that it's inflatable down on the bottom. And this might be me being in Minnesota, but we blow up these like enormous inflatable white domes over like football fields in the winter and then heat them so we can go and like play sports basically.
Yeah.
And it reminds me a lot of that. It looks almost identical except for ours. They're not like that curved. They're more of just like a giant igloo.
Yeah. Yeah. Great point. Good. So we have this base structure, and I'm guessing, Ellen and Meredith, that comes in the form of the curvature of this structure. Is there anything else that you see in this building? I mean, there are a million things you could see in this building, but when you think about the form, does it remind you of anything else? Yeah, Matthew.
I hope I'm not reading into it, but we've discussed a lot. It maybe a feminine like feature.
Yeah, absolutely. So it has an anthropomorphic, kind of almost Victorian feminized form, right? You can imagine a woman in a tightly bustled dress with a tight waist and this skirt coming out of the bottom. Absolutely. And all of those readings are intentional. This is pre-Zaha Hadid, this is after Nehemiah, but there is a direct push to try to give buildings a whole new form than they've had before, moving away from the squares and rectangles that you see in the background of the image to something entirely new, something perceived as almost living. The project that we saw in the slide before and that we're seeing in detail here is Victor Lundy's pavilion for the Atomic Energy Commission, designed to showcase the Atoms for Peace project. Have you ever heard of the Atoms for Peace project? Okay, so after World War II, there was Oppenheimer and others, there was a huge concern that they had unleashed something that they didn't expect, and now wanted to be sure to control. And so the US Atomic Energy Commission started up a publicity campaign basically for the good uses of atomic energy. This ranged from this pavilion that you saw the image of, which traveled throughout Latin America and into Europe. And the idea behind the pavilion was to show the power of atomic energy in scientific application, as well as domestic applications. We'll get to that in a second. And as this pavilion traveled, a group from the AEC went along with the pavilion and met with the scientific community in each of the countries to which it traveled to offer terms for the development of atomic energy. The US, in essence, would hold all of the atomic materials and they would license them to the different states who were willing to get on board. It was an early way of trying to control proliferation and to put America at the center of that proliferation discussion. So what does that have to do with Lundy's shape? Lundy created an inflatable form, an inflatable pavilion, and this served a couple of purposes. One, it could be put up and taken down quite easily. As we saw from that curvilinear form, it was really a stunner. People moving through the city would be drawn to know what this thing is, and there's a production to putting up an inflatable gigantic tent of this type. Just as I'm sure you've seen, Lucas, when they start to put them up as winter comes, you know, it's almost like a growing body that is emerging from the ground and rising up above the surface for whatever coverage needs to happen inside. So inside this tent were a series of exhibitions you can see on the left. And then in this dome that we're just starting to see right here, they had a series of radiated samples so that you could get close, but hopefully not too close, to the experiments that were driving this propaganda machine, driving the development of atomic energy, and driving this international collaboration as well. If that seems problematic, I am excited to introduce you to the Atoms for Peace project in detail. So this began, as you can see here on the left, as a traveling exhibition inside a cute little converted bus van where you could go in and see experiments at work. Not only that, you as a gardener could send off for a piece of radiated material, as well as a little, you can see here this little post and cantilevered, almost little bird feeder or circular mailbox, where you put your radiated material in there and then watch your plants transform into things you had never seen them do before. You can imagine the problems with this, sending radiated material to homeowners. It was low dose radiation, but nonetheless, it's not something that anyone would suggest that you try at home today. And the idea at the time, and the scientific community as well as the media went wild about this. The idea was that through the use of radiation, we could make places like the North Pole warm, forested, habitable areas, or we could transform plants and animals into larger, better, bigger versions of themselves. The place where this really took hold, because the results were so unpredictable, they tried to radiate anything under the sun, and sometimes it just killed the plants, of course, and sometimes it created, in the case of the poppies that I'm showing you on the left, sometimes you could get two bulb heads on the top of a single plant. Sometimes things would become wild and crazy colors that were unpredictable. So the place that we have really seen this idea of using radiation take off. Of course, we see it in medical research, but also most of the seeds that you buy today have been through some form of this treatment. And in particular, cantaloupe, any sort of cantaloupe that you could, excuse me, not cantaloupe, grapefruit, any sort of grapefruit that you can buy at the store today is the process of this irradiated treatment. They're larger, juicier, pinker, more pink than they ever were before. That's the place where this kind of decade or two of research finally hit a sellable product. But if you read about this time and the speculations, it was just more than bizarre. So as we've said over and over again, you know, when new tech emerges, new architectural forms will emerge. And Victor Lundy's pavilions were an attempt to capture this spirit of knowing that there are particles, materials, atoms in the world that are doing something that we can't see. They're active elements in the air, in the world around us, with impact, but not actually like a physical quality to them, or at least not one visible. Lundy took this idea and tried to embed that in this use of pneumatic structures. He was fascinated by the idea of using air to create architecture, and you can see the really elegant and beautiful results of that experiment. looking at the image in the middle, what comes to mind?
It looks like a big bundle of balloons that you get like the carnivals.
Yeah.
It's honestly like, pretty inviting. It looks fun.
Yeah, absolutely. It's very playful. Great. And definitely balloon shape. What else?
A mushroom blast of an atomic bomb.
Yeah, 100%. He was taking that imagery and trying to make it playful, more accessible, but also showcasing exactly what was the technological development of the time of the hour. And he did this at the New York World's Fair, which is showcasing sort of like the first and foremost in terms of invention in everything from architecture to atomic energy. The famous architecture theorist Reiner Banham has written a bit about Lundy's work. And he really saw it as creating something of a living organism out of architecture. Something that before was like a piece by piece by piece process could now just really breathe and grow into a living shape. And this became a whole new way of thinking about building homes, building temporary structures, building pool covers in cold places, covering stadiums. There were attempts to make these into domestic structures as well, but the sound and the energy requirements to keep these things inflated, if you've ever been to a bouncy castle, you know what I'm talking about, just that loud noise going on in the background, was too much, and they were unsuccessful for most applications, but not all. As Matthew pointed out, there's this heavy hanging resonance between the experiments that went on to put the atomic bomb into action in World War II and the building itself, and particularly the pavilion's purpose in terms of controlling access to atomic energy. And in a way, this takes us kind of full circle from thinking about the materials in one's environment, how to utilize, how to cooperate with them, how to appropriate them at the most extreme, into something that can be used for human purposes, whether those purposes are productive or destructive. And what we see in Lundy is a leap toward what's called command control architecture. This tendency to do just what it says, command and control, through the use of human ingenuity and mastery. That's really where this conversation ends and begins in a way. Moving through architecture history up through the 20th century desire to master nature, to put it under human control, to feel like we had the power over all materials to use for our own good, has recently been fully challenged by the coronavirus, right? This more than, well, it's probably a microscopic element that reminds us that we are not in control and not all things are at our command. It probably will be. Let's hope it will be in short order for everybody's sake. But it's one of those reminders that we are human in our best capacities and also in our frailty. That's the end of my lectures for the semester. Questions, comments, feedback? Questions about the exam? Okay, that'll follow the same format as the last two. We'll hold it on Monday during the regular class time, except for those of you who've told me otherwise, and that works out just fine too. All right, well, thank you all. It's really been a pleasure. I hope our paths will cross again in future classes.
Thank you, Dr. Moore.
Yep, take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Dr. Moore.
you.
Thank you.
Thanks.